My name is Jan Williams. I'm the director here at the Buttonwoods Museum. This talk tonight is part of our spring lecture series and was organized by our intern, our archaeology intern, Liz Mann. Thank you for coming. I want to acknowledge and honor the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples past and present upon whose land and waterways the Buttonwoods Museum is located. Our speaker tonight is Marla Taylor. Marla is the Curator of Collections for the Robert S. Peabody Institute of Archaeology on the Phillips Academy campus in Andover. And she's going to talk about understanding NAGPRA and give us a case study that they worked with the Wabanaki community at Ferry Sea. So, thank you, Marla. And I'm going to hit the lights so you can see the screen.
Can you guys hear me all right? Too close to the mic? Okay. Projector.
That mic is just for the camera.
Oh, all right, then I'll be kinder to the mic. Thank you. So hi, everybody. Thank you for coming tonight. Again, my name is Marla Taylor. I work as the Curator of Collections at the Robert S. Peabody Institute of Archaeology at Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts. The longest institutional name you can possibly have. And I'm going to talk to you all tonight about NAGPRA, which is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, and give you a case study of how our institution has worked through this so that you can have a real-world example of how the law affects real life. Okay? Since this is a small group, I'm open to you guys interrupting me with questions. That's totally fine with me, okay? So I also have a land acknowledgement from Phillips Academy, so I did want to start with that, and acknowledging that we are on native land, and we acknowledge Phillips Academy's presence on the land once inhabited by the Pennacook and Pawtucket peoples, as well as the modern-day Abenaki, Massachusetts, Wampanoag, Wabanaki, Pokanoket, and Nipmuc nations. Phillips Academy honors all Indigenous peoples who are here now, have been here for time immemorial, and will be here in the future. I hope this will make a little bit of sense in the context of what we're going to be talking about today. Okay, so before we jump into all of that, just some basics about the Peabody Institute, where I work, what we do. So I'm going to move kind of quickly through this, because there are some important things to know. First, the institution was founded by a gift from Robert S. Peabody in 1901 to Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts. So Peabody was Phillips Academy class of 1857 and took up an interest in archaeology. He donated his collection of approximately 40,000 items and a large financial gift to create what is now the Peabody. There are other institutions with the name Peabody. I suspect you have heard of that, right? There's one at Harvard, there's one at Yale, and then there's the Peabody Essex. All of those are founded by the same family money, but by different individuals within the family. So while we share a name, we are not related to those institutions. Okay? And about a year ago, we completed the first full physical inventory of the collection and came to the number of over 600,000 individual items represented in the institutional collection. The collection is almost exclusively Native American in origin, heavily focused on the Americas, with the strongest representation in the Northeast in New England, the Southeast of the U.S., as well as the Southwest. And the Peabody is currently undergoing some building renovations, and the collections are currently available. So thanks for giving me something to do. All right, so what is NAGPRA and how does it work, okay? The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act was enacted in 1990 to outline a requirement and process for museums and federal agencies to return certain Native American cultural items, and those are human remains, funerary objects, sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony to lineal descendants, culturally affiliated Indian tribes, or Native Hawaiian organizations. This is an important piece of civil rights legislation, and it's best kind of thought of in that lens. And it was meant to balance the interests between tribal communities and museums, archaeologists, and other scientists as well. It's not entirely successful in that, we'll talk about that later, but it has been an impactful piece of legislation. I do just want to mention that there are new draft regulations for the law that are under evaluation like right now. So what I'm talking about are the regulations as they currently stand, not the draft regulations because those haven't been enacted yet. Okay, that was a lot of words. Just don't read them all, just listen to me, okay? So before we get into how the law works, I want to define some terms. Okay, so these definitions you see there come from the law. I'm going to give you the Marla version, okay? So basically, associated funerary objects are items that were placed with ancestral remains at the time of death or later, and those ancestral remains are or were in the possession of a museum, okay? They can also be items that were made specifically for burial purposes, like an urn that somebody would have been placed in, okay? Unassociated funerary objects, UFOs, are items that are reasonably believed to have been placed with ancestral remains at the time of death or later, but those remains are not in the possession of a museum, okay? This could be because the remains were not removed at the time of excavation or because they were not present for some other reason. Perhaps they went back to the earth in a way that the objects did not, okay? And then the third important definition is cultural affiliation. And cultural affiliation is a relationship of shared group identity that can be reasonably traced between a present-day tribal group and an identifiable earlier group. So this concept is really core to NAGPRA. It's the idea that cultural continuity can be recognized between modern tribal groups and their ancestors. Okay? NAGPRA is both really simple and super complex at the same time. Okay? Basically, you follow the steps that I'm going to go over, and then it ends up in a repatriation and everybody's happy. So museums are tasked with creating item-level summaries and inventories of what is present in their collections. This is supposed to be done in consultation with tribes right from the very beginning. Those documents are then submitted to National NAGPRA, which is the federal department that oversees compliance with the law, which is part of the National Park Service. Okay? And it's shared then with the federally recognized tribes, and then this information sits in a database that tribes have access to, and museums. Tribes can make a claim for ancestors by reaching out to the museum with physical possession, okay? Then the next step is consultation between the tribes and the museum to determine that all-important cultural affiliation, that tie between the modern community and their ancestors, okay? I literally got a claim email half an hour ago from a tribe. Okay, so cultural affiliation, again, that idea that cultural continuity can be recognized, can be determined using one or more of these lines of evidence as outlined in the law. Okay? Under the law, all these lines of evidence are considered to have equal weight. No one subject is more important or valuable than any other subject, okay? And then you have to meet the threshold of what's called a preponderance of the evidence, which is the lowest legal threshold that exists. A preponderance of the evidence means you just need 51% of the evidence to point you in that direction. Okay, it's not beyond a reasonable doubt, which we all hear about in courts. It's just a preponderance of the evidence. Okay? And again, it can come from any of these. It doesn't have to be in all of them. Okay. So if affiliation is determined, if that continuity is identified, the next step is for the museum to write what's called a notice of inventory completion or a notice of intent to repatriate to submit back to National NAGPRA for ultimate publication in the Federal Register, which is the official federal government record of all the laws and things that go out there. Okay. There are two different types of documents because they cover different types of material. One is for ancestors and associated funerary objects. One is for unassociated funerary objects and sacred items. Okay? So that's why we have two sets of initials up there to make it more complicated. Are you guys with me so far? Yes. Okay. All right, thank you. So if affiliation is not determined, okay, if you do not have that continuity, the ancestral remains and associated funerary objects are reported as what's called culturally unidentifiable, okay? Or CUI, more initials for you. If the ancestors and funerary items are considered CUI, then the museum sort of presses pause on the repatriation process and retains physical and legal control of those items, okay? Now, there were regulations passed in 2010 to provide a path for the disposition of those ancestors and associated items to tribes, But this process that does exist denies that recognition of cultural affiliation and that denies that recognition of cultural continuity. It just says, these people are from Massachusetts, you are a tribe in Massachusetts, they probably are related to you somehow, or you guys are at least in the same place, so why don't you take care of it? Okay? So it does facilitate repatriation and return, but it doesn't recognize that cultural continuity. We're going to come back to that, as you can probably imagine. So after those documents are then published, there is a 30-day waiting period to allow any other tribal group to contest that affiliation decision if that's made. And after that, that's when the physical transfer can occur. So I've been asked before, how long does the repatriation take? It can be as fast as 6 to 8 months. It can take 10 to 20 years on a variety of factors. Okay? So this is a really cool flow chart I found from the National Park Service about how repatriation is supposed to go. It looks really clean and neat, right? Really simple. Not so much. And so while overall, I do think NAGPRA is fairly successful in achieving its goals, there are definitely some flaws in the law and some obstacles, okay, to that process that we just laid out. Yes, ma'am?
I'm just not clear on what is the basic goal of NAGPRA?
The basic goal is to facilitate repatriation. The idea is museums don't need boxes and drawers of human remains sitting on shelves that were taken from the ground without the consent of the communities that they came from. They were taken largely in a very colonialist way of curiosity of those other brown people over there and then stored on shelves as oddities. It doesn't need to be that way. We can give it back to them. Think of it again as civil rights.
And who is asking for it then? What kind of agencies would be the tribes?
So the tribes themselves often have a tribal historic preservation officer. They have an office that's meant to deal with this, and they sometimes have repatriation specialists as well. And it's a requirement for any institution that meets the definition of museum. And a museum under the law is an organization that has accepted federal funding. Okay? So if you're in Buttonwoods accepts federal funding, they're subject to NAGPRA. Phillips Academy no longer accepts federal funding, but they did in the past, so they're subject to NAGPRA. Okay? So it's that federal funding bucket that's most important that flags you as the need for compliance. Okay? Any other questions about that before we move into this?
No, I just have a different question.
Sure.
If you're a specific tribe, how do you know to what museum you might go to seek something?
We, the museum, should be creating an inventory, a list of things that are in our institutional collection, and we should be submitting that to National NAGPRA, and then the tribes have access to that database.
I just wondered how that connection worked.
Yes, that's a great question. This is confusing if you've never heard of this before. I fully recognize that. You guys ask me questions. That's totally fine. Okay? All right. So now we're going to talk about some of the flaws, which I think is going to address some of the other questions that might be kind of lingering. Okay? So there's some really great articles out there about repatriation right now. I can give you some websites to go check it out. But a lot of the publicity about NAGPRA and repatriation is focused on what we call ethnographic materials. Okay? Basic distinction within the field of anthropology. Archaeology are materials that come from below the ground, right? They are excavated up and kept in museum records. And the ethnographic materials are things that are collected from people, from above the ground, okay? Think of clothing, think of baskets, think of ceramic vessels, okay? For archaeology, think of projectile points, think of broken pieces of ceramic, think of bone tools and stone tools like that, okay? So a lot of times you'll hear about ethnographic materials because it's kind of sexier, if you will, instead of like a projectile point. It's a headdress or it's a garment, okay? But the reality is a lot of institutions have enormous archaeological collections kind of behind their closed doors that make up the majority of material that's actually subject to the law. Absolutely the case for us. I suspect the case for Buttonwoods as well. When dealing with old archaeological collections, the first and primary obstacle is poor record keeping of most field notes, right? So early 20th century excavators were not great especially by today's standards. For example, there's materials at the Peabody from sites that are literally labeled 5 miles north of Phoenix. Or east of Judge Truly's farm. Okay? So any list of materials excavated or mapped are often incomplete and lacking that provenience in objects' three-dimensional location and space, and other association. And it can be a real challenge to figure out what is actually associated with ancestral remains and what is not. And many museums do not have full physical inventories of their collection. I'm sorry to tell you this, especially small institutions. We do our best. We do, but it's often an ongoing project. Okay? The Peabody recently completed the first full physical inventory. We were around 1901. We finished it in 2021. The first time somebody systematically went through and touched everything and made sure that there was a record of everything present. Okay? That's common. And without doing that, it's really challenging, if not impossible, to understand what portions of the collection should be discussed in consultation, because you don't even know what you have a lot of times. Okay?
Yeah. Why is that? I'm a retired librarian. I can't fathom this.
Marla, can I answer? Please, Dad, answer. Because, at least with historical societies that have become later museums, most historical societies in New England were founded around the turn of the 20th century. Like this one, we were, chartered in 1897, but we got this property in 1903. There was no mission statement, there was no collection policy, and the powers that be at that time took in every single thing that was dumped on the doorstep. And this includes, I cleaned out my mom and dad's attic and I just can't throw this stuff away. And our collection here, we are still working. We've been working for 15 years since I've been here to catalog everything in this collection, and we're not done yet. I originally thought we had 25,000 objects, and I now know we have a heck of a lot more than that.
Absolutely, and that is a common story. A lot of museums put emphasis on education and exhibition and outreach. That's where a lot of the budget goes. The behind-the-scenes collection work, especially the stones and bones, if you will, tend to get put at the bottom of the list. That's really common. Please let that shock you. Please be bothered by that, but that is the reality. So the other thing is, poor museum records in and of themselves. Again, starting at the turn of the century, again, Judge Truly's farm. Good luck.
A trunk of clothes.
Yes.
A trunk of clothes. A bunch of books, literally. I was the director of the North End of Historic Site for 34 years, and we spent all that time trying to get to our collection. So you can't identify it. So. And they used to use adhesive tape to put the numbers on. And as we all know, it will just rot and fall off. And there's no numbers anymore. So that is why.
Little pieces of paper blow away. Little pieces of things get put back in the wrong boxes. Human error. It's just the reality that those of us who work in this field, we know, and now you know too. If your local historical society needs donation, maybe don't go for the exhibition and go for the collections work. Just saying. Okay, another really complicating factor to NAGPRA compliance is the prevalence of split and shared collections across institutions, again, particularly archaeological. Split collections are those taken from the same site at the same time and then split or divided amongst two different institutions, often as trades or gifts or something like that. Shared collections are taken from the same site at different times, and it usually involves multiple institutions or expeditions, but they're going to be related to each other because they come from the same place and they could complement each other that way. Peabody and Buttonwoods have some of these things, right? And we've been in communication about them, and that's just one example, right? The whole second half of this is going to be a very specific example. Okay. So another complexity is that those tribal historic preservation offices have their own priorities and limitations, right? Their priorities are not my priorities. Mine are not theirs, right? There's often tribes have only one person to do all archaeological compliance work for the entirety of their reservation, as well as interfacing with every museum that's trying to contact them about materials in the collection. It's a huge issue. Okay? So getting in touch with somebody and hearing back can be really challenging. Personal relationships are key. And I would say one of the biggest flaws in the law is what we bolded here, is that museums retain decision-making power over that cultural affiliation, that cultural continuity, okay? All that potential evidence for cultural affiliation can be presented by a tribe, but it is the museum who gets to decide if it meets that 51% threshold. We have the power in reality. Okay? So NAGPRA was an attempt to balance that power dynamic and present a pathway towards physical repatriation, but this one really, really important aspect of the law leaves the real power in the hands of museums and those who have the possession of the pieces. And this power can be abused. Okay? Clearly I don't use it. No, I'm just kidding. So this is an example of data from the National NAGPRA website. So I just want to show, step away from the mic. You can see this is all the ancestors reported to National NAGPRA as of 2022. You can see that 48% plus this 3% are pending, as in they are not culturally affiliated. So more than half of the ancestral remains of Native Americans in institutions today are still in that CUI bucket, that culturally unaffiliated bucket. Okay? So I'm going to zoom in on Maine here because that's what I'm going to talk about next. When I first made this presentation, the numbers were different, so we've made some shifts here. So Maine does not have a relatively large number of ancestors that have yet to be repatriated, but the work is still incomplete. The number is drastically different than in 2020 when there were 54% pending repatriation, and now there's only 12% pending repatriation. Okay? We're going to get to that again. All right. So before I get into like the specific real world example that I hope will answer some additional questions, is there anything else you guys want to know about right now?
I have a question. When you find remains, who's the one who decides that it's a Native American?
Super
I
great
mean,
question.
is the state archivist? Do they do the DNA? I mean, like, how do you get to, only because I did my genealogy and my great-great-great-grandfather in Andover found a body plowing this field. And who knew what it was? You know what I mean? I can't find, we never got the story of how that happened, but it scared the crap out of Tim. But the thing is, who does that to begin with? You're talking about, you have an identified body, but who does that identification?
So there's several ways that happens. If you're saying something in an institutional collection, I can answer that one a little bit easier first.
Yeah.
Somebody in an institutional collection.
I do.
There are physical anthropologists. As much as we can say race doesn't make a difference, that is largely true. There are some traits that are more likely in one race than they are in another race. So you can look at bones, and a skilled physical anthropologist can say this person has typical Native American skeletal features. Okay? You also, context is key. Context is key. Where did that person come from? Was anything found around them? How deep below the surface were they? What can you see in that area? And everything that feeds into that. So today, if you find a body while you're digging, stop. And you call the state, you call the medical examiner, and they'll come and take a look, and they'll refer it to the state historic preservation officer as well. So tribes have a tribal historic preservation officer, states have a state historic preservation officer. And so they call it the SHPO. So the SHPO office kind of takes the lead with that. And there's a whole law to deal with that. It's called Section 106, which I'm not an expert on, so I'm not going to pretend to tell you exactly what's in it, but I can tell you that it exists and it covers that
I
type
just
of
know that happens.
Yeah.
Thank you. I didn't find a body.
Okay. All right. So now I'm going to give you a specific example for our institution and the Wabanaki Confederacy and NAGPRA compliance. Okay. First, I'm going to outline who's involved. Okay. The Wabanaki Confederacy is in Maine. These are the federally recognized tribes of Maine. The Aroostook Band of Micmacs, the Holton Band of Maliseets, the Passamaquoddy at Indian Township, Passamaquoddy at Pleasant Point, and the Penobscot Nation. Okay. In the 1990s, 4 institutions who curated major collections from Maine decided to work together for NAGPRA repatriation. So in the past, there had been some of that trading or transferring of collections between these organizations, and many of the collections were split or shared between our institutions. I'm talking specifically about material from Maine now, okay? And working together was an attempt to streamline the consultations for both the Wabanaki and the museums, as well as pool grant funds and resources, because repatriation isn't free. So these institutions were the Robert S. Peabody Institute of Archaeology, the Maine State Museum, the Abbey Museum up at Bar Harbor, and the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology at Harvard. I'm just going to call them Harvard to not use the Peabody name too much and get confusing here, okay? Okay, so I'm going to walk us through this with a timeline, okay? Number one, the Nevin Shell Heap was excavated by a man named Doug Byers in 1936 to 1940. Okay? And archaeological, so Doug Byers was the curator. No, wait. He was the director then at the Peabody Institute. Okay? So in archaeology terminology, Nevin is what we call a multi-component burial and habitation site with multiple occupations. I'm going to break that down a little bit. Okay? So it was a shell heap, which is a human-generated accumulation of shell resulting from shellfish harvesting, but it can potentially include complex layers of habitation, right, living surfaces, food refuse, meaning, when you shuck the oyster, you throw the shell down, okay? Redeposited shell, and in the case of the Nevin site, human burials as well. Soft shell clam, oyster, and quahog shells comprise the deposit at Nevin, okay? And this shell-rich context created an environment of exceptional preservation over time. The calcium in the shells really helped things last for a very long time. So the dates associated with Nevin came from radiocarbon dating bone and shell that had been preserved in the shell heap. And there are a couple of periods of gaps in the occupation of the site around the transition from what we call the late Archaic period, roughly 3,500 years ago. Okay? So according to the records that I have access to at the Peabody Institute, there are approximately 45 ancestors, and that's how I'm going to refer to people. I'm not going to talk to them about bodies or human remains, I'm going to call them ancestors, that were then removed from the shell heap. And along with them were over 1,000 associated funerary belongings, meaning things that were put deliberately, clearly with them, as well as over 3,000 additional items. And I would consider a large portion of those additional items to be probably UFOs, unassociated funerary items. Okay? All right, our timeline, hope this will help tell the story here. So in the ensuing decades, Byers conducted research, internal research on the items from Nevin, and the ancestral remains were loaned to the Peabody at Harvard. Okay? But the other artifacts and items remained at the Peabody Institute. Okay, so people went to Harvard, the material that was buried with them stayed Peabody Institute. Okay. For a variety of reasons, Byers did not publish his work, and the first publication to examine the site was released in 1974, which was about 15 years after his death. So shortly before NAGPRA was passed in 1990, the staff at the Peabody Institute decided to formally transfer the known ancestral remains from Nevin Shell Heap to Harvard. It had been an informal loan before. We decided to put it down on paper and to sign all the official documents before the law was passed. So it was clear who would be responsible for what. Okay? The two institutions, while this seems a little strange, the two institutions had an intertwined history, okay, with split collections, dating back to the earliest activities at the Peabody by a man named Warren Moorhead. He's a friend of ours. And there was a lack of professional interest in acquiring ancestral remains by Moorhead. He was much more interested in stone tools or what he called prehistoric relics. So the attitude was sort of, well, you guys already have a lot of ancestors down there. You need some more to complete your studies. You go ahead and take them. Okay? It's almost verbatim from letters. In this case, the institutions were aware that NAGPRA was coming and were trying to formalize informal agreements before the law was passed. So then, oops, I'm so sorry. Okay. approaches to consultation. So, as the Peabody Institute began consultations related to the passage of the law in 1990, the staff collaborated with those other institutions that we talked about, and together they chose to consult on all the collections from Maine. They treated the entire state of Maine as one thing to talk about, okay? All 4 of these institutions together. Instead of going site by site, because like down East Maine is going to be very different from the border with New Hampshire, and going to be very different from the Canadian border, right? But they kind of talked about everything in one lump. So it seemed logical at the time, but it was kind of unwieldy. Each museum had internal differences on policy and priority, the size and nature of the collections, and the different interpretations of the statutes of the law. Remember, we retain decision-making and power about that affiliation. Okay? So the intention to create a united and collaborative front was a real double-edged sword, because there was peer pressure for consistency, right, and a desire to present a unified front. Okay? So in an effort to assist museums and agencies in making cultural affiliations determinations, the Maine State Historic Preservation Office, that SHPO office, okay, shared guidelines regarding temporal and geographic boundaries for affiliation. I'll explain that. The guidelines were based largely on archaeological evidence and drew a line at 1,000 years before present. That's roughly, 1,000 present is considered, I guess it's considered like 80 BC, so 1,000 years BC, you can say. So the SHPO recommended that any ancestors with funerary belongings older than that date were too far removed from the contemporary Wabanaki for cultural affiliation. The Maine State Historic Preservation Office provided guidance based on archaeological evidence that anything older than 1,000 years before present could not be tied to the modern Wabanaki peoples. So now they meant that as guidance, okay? But, and presumably, right, the museums took it as guidance, but the Wabanaki groups perceived that the museums were using that information to predetermine their cultural affiliation decisions. Probably were. So it's hard to understand why this became contentious really quickly. Okay? And that Nevin site predates this time period. Okay? So in addition to that conflict, one of the central questions in Maine's archaeological history is the relationship between what's called the end of the late Archaic phase, fancy words, roughly 6,000 to 4,000 years before present, and the beginning of what's called the Susquehanna tradition, which happened about 3,600 years before present. So there's a little bit of a gap there and a range. Transitions like this are recognized by a shift in material culture, meaning like the projectile points will now be a different shape, where the ceramic vessels are now a different shape or done with a different type of material. So you see a shift in the material culture of the people around these time periods pretty consistently across the region, which is how we kind of make these timelines. So the question of whether or not this transition represents population replacement, one group dies off and a new group moves in, or if it's just a natural shift in new people arriving to the area and a shift in ideology, was a real focus of scholarship and debate in Maine in the 80s and 90s and even into the early 2000s. Okay? Some archaeologists who were involved in these consultations were deeply professionally vested in these debates. They wanted to be the one that was right. Okay? And they pointed to those gaps in the cultural material as evidence of cultural discontinuity, okay, in the archaeological record. And so, or at least a lack of cultural consistency. Do you guys follow that? Do you need some clarity? Okay. So lots of arguing about that.
Excuse me for a second.
Yes.
Would that be like, and I don't mean to use this term, check of the government and I'm here to help. Was that a lot of what the attitude, or was it that they truly were trying to be politically correct but not oversighting? You know what I mean?
They were trying to be helpful and saying, based on all those lines of evidence that you can look at, if you're going to look at the archaeological line of evidence, this is our archaeological evidence that we're going to present to you. But remember, you just need one of those lines of evidence to cross that 51% threshold. Not every single one of them. Not even two of them. Just one. So, this is from a fantastic resource called NAGPRA Comics. If you just Google that, you'll find NAGPRA Comics. It's great. I love it. There's only a few issues out, but it really explains things nicely. So, in 2005, okay, we're going to fast forward up to 2005 now, approximately 90% of the ancestral remains and funerary items from Maine that were housed at the Peabody Institute had been culturally affiliated and repatriated to the Wabanaki. Only 2 sites fell into that CUI bucket, that culturally unidentifiable bucket. One was that Nevin site we were talking about, and one was another one called McCain site in Penobscot County. As you can imagine, the decision didn't go down well to do 90% culturally affiliated, but pull back on these 2 particular sites. Okay? And all the positive relationships that have been developed in identifying affiliation for that 90%, kind of fell apart in the conversations about Nevin. It seemed to have solidified into an us versus them dynamic between the Wabanaki and those New England museums that we were talking about. So, it's just, I look back at that and think, who knows what opportunities were lost there from years of disagreement. Okay. Oh, sorry, I missed that slide. The other one was cooler anyway. Okay. So when I started at the Peabody in 2008, can I go back a slide? Nope. All right. Anyway, the little orange dot on the timeline was supposed to be me coming in. I got my slides messed up. But when I started at the Peabody back in 2008, this had all already been decided, right? All that history we went through had already happened. I understood that Nevin was a site of burials, but my understanding of NAGPRA and the law was relatively limited at the time, and I just trusted that my supervisors had done what was appropriate under the law. And so the excavation of the Nevin site itself was always presented to me and visitors to the institution as a pivotal point in the history and science of archaeology. The items taken were discussed with this reverence that I didn't really hear being used for other portions of the collection, and they were considered unique and special within the world of archaeology, and there was open discussion within the institution about what a disservice it would be to science and archaeology to repatriate them back to the Wabanaki because they'd just be reburied, and we just can't let that happen, is what I heard. And that just sounded strange to me the whole time. I never heard of the excavations at Nevin the way I had heard of other sites represented at the Peabody's collection in, my archaeology 101 classes or any of the readings I had done for my undergraduate degree. I had just never heard of it. So I went and I got Byer's 1974 publication and I read it and I was like, what am I missing? What is so special about these things? What's happening? And I just genuinely couldn't figure it out. So I thought something like, I'm just missing something, right? I'm the stupid one. I don't know what's going on here. I didn't understand how something could be so special that it would be a disservice to science to return it, because that's not part of the law. And so I did more research on the item typology represented to try to educate myself, because there are some really cool loose bone daggers that are unique within New England. But I just couldn't figure it out. So I also just didn't really understand why it should matter what happens to the items after you repatriate them. That shouldn't be a factor in your decision making. But these things mattered to the people who were in charge of decision making about cultural affiliation. So 2009, that's me coming, and then we had 2009, the National NAGPRA announced they were going to be issuing regulations to add procedures for the disposition of those culturally unidentifiable ancestral remains. They were like, there are too many of you, put ancestors in the CUI bucket. That's not cool. Now we're going to give tribes a way to claim those individuals. Okay? So this new regulation required renewed consultation on those ancestors and provided a pathway for those repatriations. But the regulations gave the museum the option to return funerary items with those ancestors. Okay? So the then director at the Peabody Institute immediately inferred that Nevin was going to become contentious again. She was right. And began to prepare for implementation of the regulations in 2010. So So in 2011, the Wabanaki Confederacy, all those tribes again, sent a claim letter, because remember, we published a notice, a list of everything that we had, and then they needed to make a claim, and we needed to then evaluate that claim for cultural affiliation. Okay? So they sent us a claim letter by a woman named Bonnie Newsom, who was the Penobscot Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, and she was like, no more consultation, we've already given you the evidence, say we're culturally affiliated and we're good. Like,
I have a question.
Yeah.
When you're trying to verify that this particular tribe, are there criteria that is used to do that? To make sure that, that it's going to the right people?
That's a very common question. Again, that criteria is determined by the institution who has the decision-making power. In real-world practice of repatriation, I have not heard of anyone, even anecdotally, trying to just claim any ancestor that they can find. This is a big responsibility, to claim your ancestor and ensure that they get an appropriate burial back where they came from and are healed, essentially. People don't undertake this lightly. It's a long process. It's an expensive process at times. And it's, you're not going to ask for other people's ancestors.
Right.
Is largely what I've seen. So again, they have to demonstrate that cultural affiliation through those lines of evidence. And you just talk to each other. It's not just an exchange of letters in the mail. It's a conversation because it's a person on the other side of the table from you. And you can ask questions and gauge their answers and move on from there. Okay. This is again from those NAGPRA comments. So the challenge became, because the Peabody Institute only had the associated funerary belongings, remember we gave those ancestors officially to Harvard, okay? The returning of the associated funerary objects under that CU water bucket was optional. So unless Harvard culturally affiliated them, we had a choice whether or not to repatriate them. Okay? But imagine if your mother passed and you put her favorite necklace in her hands so that she could have that with her as she moved on. Somebody digs her up, you're like, that necklace is cool. They take it and they put it over there on a shelf in a box for a couple hundred years and teach other people about how necklaces used to look. And meanwhile, your mother's over here in a box on a shelf. You're gonna wanna put those back together when you rebury them, right? You're gonna wanna do that. That was the whole point in the first place, was that they go together, right? So the letter from the Wabanaki was the impetus for another meeting between those institutions in the 1990s, and that conversation was not great. It was pretty clear that most of the institutions involved had every intention of continuing to deny cultural affiliation for Nevin, and then would exercise the option to not return those funerary items. I do want to take a moment and note that the representative from the Abbey Museum disagreed with that, but she wasn't really listened to in the room. So credit where credit's due. She tried to not let that happen, but she wasn't listened to. So I sat in a lot of confusion about this, right? This is happening around me. I was just a collections assistant at the time. I wasn't a decision maker. I was just watching this go on around me. So it was just confusing why this was happening. And this is where things stood until the PBD's previous director retired and the current director, named Ryan Wheeler, joined the staff. And that single change in leadership had a real cascading effect, okay? That's meant to be Ryan coming in there. So Ryan spent a lot of time researching, because he came in the midst of this and got a memo on his desk on the first day of look into this situation with Nevin, et cetera. So he spent a lot of time researching what was in that claim letter from the Penobscot TIPO, okay? Interviewing archaeologists and other experts, as well as speaking directly with the Wabanaki, going up to northern Maine and sitting at the table and listening to what they had to say. And in a dramatic break from previous practices, in 2019, the Peabody Institute recognized the cultural affiliation of the ancestors and funerary items at the institution to the Wabanaki. And this decision had some fallout. So the first fallout was really positive with the Wabanaki. We've continued to work on repatriation with our repatriation committee and are continuing to work on actually, I just published about a year ago the notice of inventory completion to affiliate all remaining ancestors and associated items from Maine. They've already come, they've taken them, they're back home, they're taken care of. I've submitted a new summary of unassociated funerary items, things that said they were taken from cemeteries. Pretty obvious that they were associated with a grave if you called the site a cemetery, just a hunch. But the second level of fallout is Harvard, because they were in possession of the ancestral remains, the Peabody's decision to affiliate the funerary items put them in a real awkward position. I didn't appreciate that. It sort of broke the working relationship between our two institutions. We're getting back to it now, but 2015, it wasn't great. And it definitely took a blow. So in August of 2021, I do want to point out that Harvard did repatriate the ancestors, but again, under that CUI way to go home. They still did not recognize the cultural continuity between these ancestors from Devon and the modern Wabanaki people. So they are home now. They have been reburied, but that cultural continuity was not recognized in the process. Okay. So, just kind of in summary, and I'll ask again for any questions you guys have, but from my perspective, the point of sharing this story is to lay out the reality of NAGPRA and repatriation work. Okay? The legal steps that I outlined in the beginning have some flaws and some obstacles, but it really comes down to the intentions of the individuals doing the work. And I think past representatives of the Peabody Institute were acting with good intentions, but the decision makers put too much emphasis on that archaeological line of evidence, and for whatever reason, seemed to create a mental block about the Nevin site. And that opposition remained in place for nearly 20 years before just fresh perspective made a change. And in many ways, I would really say that NAGPRA work is about prioritizing the humanity of the ancestors who currently reside in museums, connecting that humanity to the person who's across the table from you, representing their descendants, and then back to yourself. Just remembering that these are people. And I really see it as part of my job to attempt to correct some of the wrongs from the past and treat people, contemporaries and ancestors, the way they deserve to be treated. I've got a bunch of resources here, and I can share more things with you, but if you guys have any questions.
Before, the return of remains, were they allowed to digitize the remains so they could study in the future, or is that covered under this?
So that's not covered under the law. That will vary from tribe to tribe. The Wabanaki tribes would actually like us to destroy everything related to the excavation of those ancestors because they shouldn't have been disturbed in the first place. They would like us to destroy photographs. They would like us to destroy notes, maps, and documents.
Why is that so important?
Because they shouldn't have been disturbed in the first place, and we violated their rights after death, and it wasn't something for us to know about.
What was the role of DNA in discovering this? Did it make an impact, or were they not allowed to use it, or?
DNA is really complicated when you do this sort of thing. Complicated ethically. Very simple to do.
That's it.
Complicated ethically. Most tribes that I have worked with really hate the idea of DNA. So, if you think about it, okay, this is probably just a way you've never thought through it before, but if you think about it, if I tell you I'm white, you're just gonna believe me. If I tell you I'm black, I bet you're gonna be like, that's weird, but I'm not really gonna question that. But if somebody says they're Native American, you can be like, really, how much? What percentage blood are you? What tribe are you from? Can you speak your language? Can you show me? And you ask them to prove it over and over and over again.
Really?
Okay? Just kind of think about it, think about that. And they don't want to be identified by their DNA. A lot of tribal groups. So the idea that there's a measurable way to continue to put people in a bucket and define the boundaries of who they are by our standard is distasteful, because it's what we've been doing for hundreds of years. again, they're one of the minorities, one of the few minorities where you're like, really? Prove to me you're a minority. So DNA is not welcome in a lot of places. Some people are okay with it, depending on what it's going to be used for, but to identify an ancestor, and the challenge with that too is there's very, very small numbers of indigenous people with their DNA in those pools that you kind of compare DNA to. So you may not find a match because Native American people are like, you don't need my blood, like back away. So they're not likely to give to those sorts of databases in the first place to identify. In this particular case, Harvard wanted to do DNA analysis, and it didn't go down well.
I just wonder, in that type of situation, when the tribe asks things just remain as they are, does that cross any of the other tribes? Are they all pretty much the same?
Great question. Everybody's going to be different. There are some consistencies, and that people don't want their ancestors in museums. That's a pretty common thread. What's going to happen or how they're handled really varies. Some people want me to do the work. Some people want to do the work themselves in terms of handling. Some tribes will say only a woman should do this, only a man should do this. I've been told to avoid working with particular collections when it's a certain time of the month. I've been told to avoid working with collections when I have consumed alcohol. And it comes from a place of protection of me, because from their perception, I am weakened in those states, and they don't want anything to happen to me. So it's protection from me.
No, really?
What could happen?
I don't want to find out. I'm not interested in finding out. I don't believe in voodoo, but I'm not going to mess with somebody who has a voodoo doll, right? I'm not going to cross that line.
It's their belief, it's their...
Their spirit.
Yeah,
Their spirit.
perception power. And historical.
I have a question. I know you picked Maine. Is there anybody doing anything or findings in our area?
Absolutely.
I mean, is that you or Margaret, or, like, if we want to come and find some more information, or like what is, like, I'm from the Historical Society. We never had Indians. Right? But we found burial grounds where they dug up 93, but nobody cared, is what we hear all the time. Because they think Havel had the Indians that were fighting with, the French and Anadustin, and then Lowell had Pawtuckaways, and so Bethune was the great big world's end in the middle. But anyway, so you have to have, there has to be tribes somewhere, even if they're just hunting villages. So I'm wondering, because folks have, I do some of the research on the education stuff, folks have asked about it. And I'm wondering where would I be able to go to get some kind of information about, yes, we have found this, or no, we haven't found this.
So starting with the State Historic Preservation Office, starting with the Massachusetts, what's it called? Oh, I can't believe I'm blanking on it. The MHC. Yes, thank you. MHC has records of all the sites in across the state that have been found.
Okay.
They can't share specific details of site location with you for privacy, but they can say in this area, yes, there have been this many sites and they contain this type of material in there. You can also reach out to the tribe yourself if you'd like to. In this area of Massachusetts, we're really a borderland between the Abenaki from New Hampshire, the Wabanaki from Maine, the Wampanoag from the Cape, and kind of like the Nipmuc kind of coming across, and Massachusetts coming from the west. So this is not the firm, clear territory of any one tribe. It's very much a border zone. Abenakis are still around. You can contact them in New Hampshire. The Wampanoags still around. You can contact them on the Cape. Wabanaki still around. You can give them a call and ask them what they know about their life in their region.
Yeah. Thank you.
Now this is probably the first time you guys are hearing a lot of this. Am I right? And I know it can
I'm
be.
trying to imagine, all these remains, like, in boxes, and it's, Like, what kind of numbers are we talking about?
Okay.
This, in any way, Ken, this is totally new to me.
Sure.
But it kind of reminds me of all the things I read about art museums.
Yes.
Is it
Yes.
along the same lines?
Yes, yes it is. So you've probably seen in the news an uptick about art museums with looted materials or poor documentation and things like that. That's also a real problem in museums. This is similar to but different because of the kind of racial aspect inherent in it and the fact that it's a person, right? Like even if it's just a shelf on a tube, it's a person. I'm a mother of 2 young children. I've seen young children. I've seen babies. I've seen women my age represented in boxes, in cigar boxes. I've seen things you don't want to see. And even if they're in a pretty box, they're still in a box. I've seen one person spread between 3 different boxes.
Ooh.
They don't belong on a shelf
Right.
in a museum.
I'm curious, are you allowed, in your position, to make the final decision, or does it go through the board, or how do?
Great question. That's going to vary by institution, but we have a system at the Puberty Institute where myself and the director can make the decision.
That's easy.
It's a lot easier, and it's good that tribes appreciate speaking to the decision makers. They don't want to speak to me and then I have to talk to the director who has to go to the board and make a presentation about it, because then they're really disassociated from the process. They want to speak to the decision makers about
That's
it.
quick, yeah.
So the Keeping Institute began as with a contribution from Peabody of all this stuff. So if your goal is to repatriate, then what's left at the Institute?
So much. So much. So that's another common question that we get, right? So when Peabody made the donation, he donated about 40,000 items. We've grown to over 600,000 items over the course of the institution's history. Tribes don't want everything back. Some people have museums, some people don't. They don't have a cultural center, they don't have a repository to store it. They also want to learn about their own history. They just want you to talk to them and not like cut them out of the party, you know? Talk to them, ask what they're interested in learning about, and work together to identify a museum collection that you can learn from that way. There's lots of evidence of just daily life activities that don't fall under the auspices of the law. Because again, it's those funerary items, sacred items, and ancestral remains. The knife I use to cut up my dinner isn't really going to fall under that most of the time. So there's plenty. There's plenty. I will say that a large portion, like proportionally from our collection, will be repatriated, but it's primarily because Warren Moorhead, who was the curator for 30 years, really liked digging up graves. It was one of his favorite things to do. I really wish he wouldn't have done that. Job security, but like really inappropriate. So depends on the institution what's going to happen there.
So Marla, I know I've asked you this before, but what are your thoughts about what's been currently going on and has been going on in Egypt with the pyramids, which were intended as sacred burial?
My personal opinion, even when I was younger, I didn't like looking at mummies because it felt weird to me that they were supposed to be, they're a person who were supposed to be left there in their final resting place, and now they're on this grand international tour so people could ooh and ah over them. But I'm not a part of that culture. If the people within that cultural sphere, within Egypt, decide that is the appropriate thing to do, I've been trained as an anthropologist and archaeologist. The idea is that you don't put your cultural values onto another culture. And so that's their decision to make. I can feel icky about it, but I don't get to make the decision. You know, so I am super curious about the pyramids and would love to go, but it does weird me out to see a mummy on display because it's a person.
So she didn't see King Tut.
Any other questions, guys? NAGPRA Comics, ProPublica Repatriation Project. Okay, learn something new.
So,
Yeah, that's how you.
is your museum open exhibits?
Unfortunately not. We've got a building project going on right now.
Okay.
So we've got renovation happening. And we are a strange institution. For one, because we're part of the school, so our main spaces are classroom spaces. And in the world today as it is, we don't like having the doors open to the public when classes are in session. And second, because the collection is primarily Native American, white lady, I can't tell that story through the objects without their participation and buy-in, if I'm gonna do it respectfully and responsibly. We don't have the staff or the funding or the space to do that, so we've actually made the choice not to do it. So we're primarily focused on research, education for students at Phillips Academy, and education for students in the community that reach out to us, as well as facilitating repatriation and doing things like I'm doing, talking to you guys today.
So, I mean, I just understand what you hear tonight to talk about is the things that are affected by this law, but what about the material culture that has been found that is not, ceremonial, not funerary? I'm thinking specifically of Shattuck Farms and the fact that never mind records of a small historical society being lost, Mass Historical lost the records for part of the collection because when that dig was completed, the material was spread out to several institutions. North Andover was one of them. However, there is a huge collection from a dig with everything, with the debenture and all, that the Historical Society could never find a home for because the provenance has been lost. And they went to Mass Historical, made them come down. They looked at the name on the envelope and said, oh yeah, that's so-and-so. I said, great, can you have the record? No, he took them with him. So, I mean, it is a hard thing to even return things that, let's get beyond even, the inappropriateness of having funerary remains and ancestral remains, but just the material culture is sitting in an institution. Nobody there is trained in archaeology. Archaeology and historical objects for those who came to colonize are very different. They're not people, I know. So, I mean, I think that's a huge problem all along is that this curiosity factor, this idea that we dig up everything. And then, I don't have room in my garage, so I'm just going to give it to this guy and this guy and this guy and this guy.
Yes.
And if you don't go back and find some of the early publications, you don't even know where it went. We found that by accident.
Yeah.
That we had apparently had had been given part of that collection, and that's the only lead we ever had. But I don't know how to solve it.
It's really challenging to solve. I don't know how you solve it.
It's not my problem anymore, but I think it still has carried with me.
I can feel it coming from you.
I worked on that.
I can feel it.
And it's still, it's a concern that material is sitting there and, even if the purpose was to be taken from that site to be studied, no one's studying it because nobody knows where it is or, what it is.
Yes, that's a common problem. Archaeological collections have what's called a curation crisis, right? People love going and doing an excavation. People love the thrill of finding the thing. They don't really love taking care of the thing in a box, right? So students are always really interested in oh, my thesis is going to be to go excavate this. There's boxes of that here. Could you look at what exists without generating more? And then those things that have lost their provenience and provenance, right, that we talked about at the beginning, how troubling that can be. And I mean, it's something that would be great for museums to resolve through consultation with the tribes. I would really be an advocate for that. That is very low on their priority list. Somebody finding something in their backyard is much higher up in their priority list if they find a body or something. And Shattuck Farm, we've affiliated to the Wampanoag. So I would say contact the Wampanoag Confederacy. But yeah, it's a challenge. I feel you.
Again, is that actually what it is? I mean, did that collection come and go? And what was it? because the report's never even
Yeah.
mentioned. And I think that's the problem, is that it just shows up in places. And I mean, you know, most of that collection that came in were projectile points and things like that. Yeah. But still.
I think about stuff that's probably in Grandpa's basement.
Yes, yeah.
Did Uncle Bill tell you about that?
Yes.
Oh, I don't know.
There are people who literally find skeletons in their grandfather's closet.
No.
Yes.
Oh, God.
Yes. Yes. If you know of anything like that, please reach out. Those collections, I mean, an individual, when he passed, bequeathed his collection in his will to the Peabody Institute. He didn't tell us about it. I had no idea it was coming. I was contacted by the executor of the will. He said, like, yeah, he wants to give this to you. He bequeathed it in the will. And I was like, okay, like, what is this? Who is this, et cetera. And we have a policy of not taking randomly collected materials because we don't want to encourage random collection of materials, right? Most museums don't want that because without the context and the provenience, they are worthless for research. They're cool, but they're kind of just rocks. So I didn't want to take the collection until I did a lot more digging and a lot more research, talked to the MHC, found out his collection had been documented back in the 80s, and like he did have a list, he did have information, et cetera, et cetera. But while I was going through this, the executor of the will was like, look, if you don't take this is going in the dumpster. Like, the family doesn't want it, we don't want it, it's in my garage, I'm contacting you like he asked me to do, if you don't take it, like, that's what's gonna happen. You know, and like I said, it ended up being documented and I found research value in it. And so we were able to accession it, but that happens a lot. So there's no easy solution. So please don't pick things up if you find them, please leave them where they are. Context matters. Once you remove it from that context, you can never put it back. Okay, and we've lost a lot of information about it. If you find something you think is cool, contact the MHC. They're not gonna take it from you, you're not gonna get in trouble. They're gonna make a note and say, this person found this thing in this area, this is a potentially documented site. If there's gonna be development there in the future, now they'll see that this thing was found and they should do excavation or explorations. Okay? That's how the process actually works. The state doesn't wanna take things from you. They don't have the space, the time, or the resources, but they wanna make a documentation of it so that other people have access to that information and it's not just lost in your brain. Well, I'm here for a little bit longer to answer questions. I don't even know what time it is. Yeah, the kids are already in bed.